That's a little scary. I got to try to act smart now. Thanks for coming back. Good afternoon. In the next few minutes, we're going to do something that I think is actually impossible. I say we because I'm going to ask you to do it. I have some ideas about charting the unknown on this question, are faith and science compatible? But I'm hoping that you'll come up with some answers of your own. I say it's impossible to do, but we can get a start on it. And I think in this amount of time, and the time it takes to do a TED Talk, we can at least get some of the parameters in place. People spend their whole lives thinking about this stuff, and I think it deserves that. But I want to at least get into the nitty-gritty of some of the key issues. So here we go. The quick answer to the question, are faith and science compatible, is it depends who you ask. So I've got a couple of people who like to talk about it up here. One is Richard Dawkins. He's part of a group that's come on the last 7 or 8 years called the New Atheists. There's some other representatives of this group. I kind of like Dawkins' approach. I think he's one of the best philosophically. His book is called The God Delusion. So you know where he stands on the question of faith. I'm a delusioned person because I'm a person of faith. But that's okay. The other person is Ken Miller, who's a cell biologist and also an advocate for science in a couple of important legal cases. So the famous Dover case in Pennsylvania, he was asked to be an expert witness to talk about how intelligent design is not the same as science. It's basically creationism. He also is involved in the Kansas State School Board case, so he's a smart guy. There's a lot that he's done in this book to try and describe. About 2/3 of this book is his basically presenting evolution to people that may not understand it well. He also has a high school textbook on it. But then the last third of the book or so is his own grappling with science and faith. He's a practicing Christian, and he's very articulate about why he thinks you can put the two together. So already we have one answer that says no and one answer that says yes. What I find really interesting about these two, though, is that they know each other. Miller was here a few years ago, and after he gave his presentation, the people who put this program together, we got together for a beverage afterwards, and he was telling some stories. And one was about a radio show he was doing in New York, and apparently Dawkins was in the States. He's from England. But Miller was talking on the radio and doing this call-in show so he could, ask the professor about stuff. And apparently he misspoke, and he said something that wasn't accurate. And so Dawkins called the radio station, but he called offline. And he said, Richard, Ken, you said something wrong. You want to correct it. You don't want to look silly. But I thought, and Miller told the story because he thought it was classy, that this was sort of like the noble battle approach to things. That you could have friends that can argue about this. I think there's a message in that for a lot of us. But not for everybody. Whoops. Alex told me how to run this, and I'm not doing it well. Here we go. Wow. A hair trigger. There we go. I got to point it at that. Thanks. Two examples of people that I think have rather strident answers to the question, can faith and science get together? On the left is Francis Crick. Francis Crick is a smart guy. He and Watson are the ones that developed or understood first the structure of DNA. He's continued to live and continue to write, and he has a book on what he calls the astonishing hypothesis. And it says that your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. This hypothesis is so alien to the ideas of most people that it can truly be called astonishing. I'm going to be presumptuous and say that it also can be called wrong. Now, I'm not a Nobel Prize winner, but as a scientist, Crick has made incredible contributions. But the question he raises in this quote is to say, can we take the level of science at which we're working and say that's the whole picture? And I think that's where I would say Crick has made a misstep. But religion people do the same thing. So online I found this group, Answers in Genesis. There are many Christians who would say similar things, coming from what's called a young earth creationist point of view. And these are the folks that think that the earth is 6,000 years old, because according to the calculations they make in the Bible, that's what it looks like. And then they'll sort of argue back to say, well, then we can say that we can have scientific things that support that. In both cases, I would say there's an agenda in place, and it makes it not possible to hear what the other side is saying. And it raises a series of questions. First of all, what are they protecting? And I want to be clear that I think there's a part of what they're doing that I can admire in both cases. I want to protect science and the scientific method too. I also want to protect the Bible. I don't want it thrown out. And so the problem I have with each of these is that they've just taken one path and ignored the other. And so I would ask the question, the way that they approach protecting what's important to them, is that the only way to protect what we value and know? I think not. Well, then how do we chart the new directions? That's the question. There are different voices that work on this. There's a fellow you may have heard of, Stephen Jay Gould. He writes popular level books, Paleontology and Evolution. And in one of his books, he argues for something he calls two non-overlapping magisteria. Magisteria is a teaching authority. So he says, how about if we include both of these, the science voices and the religious voices, in the conversation, but we try not to mix them up so that they each have their place, and there's a sense of respect that comes with that. And again, I'm an admirer of Gould, but I think that maybe that doesn't go far enough. Can a person have both conversations in their own discernment on this question and listen to them both? And can they talk to each other? Or are they totally separate? If they're not totally separate, then it raises a question for how do we make sense of the conversation? And that's where the charting comes in. So, what I want to talk next is worldview. This is a famous Renaissance painting. If you had a Western Civ course or an art history course, you've probably seen this. This is by Raphael. It's finished in 1509. It's called the School of Athens. It's a vision of a Renaissance vision of who should be in the conversation. And so Raphael and the patron, the Pope who paid for the thing, has a vision of who should be talking about all the important stuff. You could spend hours talking about the way this painting is structured, but at the very least we can see there's a horizontal frame where all these people are together. There's also a vertical frame where we have this series of arches that points towards the middle of this painting. One way or the other, Raphael is saying, look at those two guys in the middle. I wonder what they're up to. And what they're up to is the guy on the left is Plato, and the guy on the right is his student Aristotle. And Plato is pointing up. And he's also got a book under his arm, and it's the Timaeus. It's a book that talks in Plato's view of how creation got here. And then Aristotle is pointing out, oh, you got to live in the world. He's got a book too, and his book is the Nicomachean Ethics. And he's saying, well, now that the world is here, how do we live together? Now, the important message that I think Raphael is sending is, these guys are talking to each other. And then all these other guys in front of the pre-Socratics. There's some really interesting characters there. The guy up in the foreground is Heraclitus, the guy leaning on a thing. And it's kind of a joke that Raphael is telling, because the picture of Heraclitus is actually the face of Michelangelo. So he's been accused of stealing from Michelangelo's work. So fine, I'll put you in the picture. So there he is. But I also want to notice there's two guys up here with globes. And the guy with his back to us is Ptolemy. Ptolemy is the guy that gives the view of the universe as current at the time, that says that the Earth is in the center of the universe, and all the stuff, the sun and the planets, go around it. The vision is kind of old-fashioned in a certain way, because we don't believe Ptolemy anymore, but the idea is there. Can we get as many people in the conversation as possible? I think he's got that part right. This painting is in the Vatican apartments in Rome. There's a series of them. Here's another one. Whoops. This is called the Disputation of the Sacrament. And there's two horizontal planes here. You got the guys down at the bottom, and they're arguing about it, all the funny hats. You got popes, you got bishops, you got scholars, and they're in front of this altar, and they're arguing about what the Eucharist means. Then up above, you have the second horizontal frame, and you got the heavenly host. So you got Peter the apostle, you got John the Baptist sitting next to Jesus, you got Jesus' mother, you got all these people. There's a nice vertical axis here that shows from God through Christ, the Holy Spirit is sent, surrounded by the four Gospels, that's what those scrolls are, centering in this sacrament on the altar that the people on earth are trying to argue about. Just a couple of things I want to notice about this. This time God's got the globe. He's got the whole world. Everybody sing. No, nobody sing. God's got it in hand. But the other thing that I like about this picture is God seems to be okay with the disputation part of this picture. It's okay to argue about this stuff. Just like the people in the School of Athens painting, you got the theologians at it. These guys love to argue, and they're okay with it, and the heavenly host is contributing to it, and God is okay with it. There's two other paintings that go in the series in the Vatican. There's one on poetry and there's one on law. And the vision in these apartments with these paintings is that we need all this stuff. It's a vision for the university. It's a vision of how we can talk about this stuff and maybe make sense of it, maybe by using as many voices as possible. Oops. So, are faith and science compatible? Still, it depends who you ask. Here's a guy that's contributing more in our era. Here's Albert Einstein. And I love this quote: the scientist's religious feeling takes the form of a rapturous amazement at the harmony of natural law, which reveals an intelligence of such superiority that compared with it, all the systematic thinking and acting of human beings is utterly insignificant reflection. The natural law being almost a Platonic idea, that there's this way that things are, and we can understand or try to understand and tap into it. Sometimes Einstein would say he wanted to know if the old one had any choice in the matter when the laws of physics came across. Now, Einstein is not any kind of traditional believer. He's a pantheist. He would have said he followed Spinoza, if you know his philosophy, in his view of God. But his instincts are such that says, when we're doing the science, we're also doing something else. Another voice that I want to bring in, depends who you ask. Well, here's another quote by Einstein: science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. And I put it up there because I want to compare it to this next guy, John Paul II, who says very much the same thing. Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw the other into a wider world, a world in which both can flourish. I find that to be, on both of their parts, a very rich understanding that there could be a conversation. We have to leave these as separate magisteria. Now, I'm going to mention a couple of people that come from the Christian tradition, but I also want to be really clear. It's the tradition I come from, so it's the one I know best. I am in no way saying that we should leave other religious traditions out of this, and I'll say this a little bit again at the end, but the work that is done in this area, talking about how theology and science can work together, is done by Muslim scholars, by Jewish scholars, Buddhist scholars. There are atheists, obviously, and agnostics that write about it. There are Jains. There's all sorts of voices in this. It's a cottage industry. I'm happy to use one part of it. So why do we have this idea that there's a problem? Is it this guy? This is Galileo. That vision of Raphael's is in the beginning of the 16th century. About a century later, this guy's writing and getting himself in trouble. What happened? Well, there's a bunch of things that have happened. One is the Reformation. And so people are really testy about who gets to interpret Scripture. And also there's a burgeoning of new scientific ideas that people don't know what to do with. And I think that's one of the most important things to say about how did we screw up the Galileo case? Well, in context, I think we can understand a little bit about what happened. But first, I want to try a little thought experiment. Because people say this: well, the church doesn't seem to get along with science, or the church rejects science, or they're anti-science. So think about this. Have you ever heard of something called a Catholic hospital? Well, yeah, we got one right down the street. Here's a picture of it. What do you figure goes on in there? Are we like dancing around the bed, burning incense, chanting? No, they got scientists in there. They're drawing blood, they're taking MRIs, they're doing all kinds of stuff. They also, because I've been in there, some of you have been in there, there's a chapel in there, so the two are seen as compatible. But the point is, there's no rejection of science. We have a reputation for having done that. And part of it may have to do with how Galileo was treated. Damn it. Here we go. Just captured damn it on the thing too, that's great. Different areas where there were problems for Galileo. One is his use of Aristotle, and then also the cosmology that comes from Ptolemy. And some authors have even said his messing with Aristotle's view of the world may have been perceived to some as also dangerous to the sacramental system, because Aristotle is the basis for understanding things like transubstantiation. So if you pull the thread on the sweater of Aristotle, maybe some other stuff comes apart. So they're basically saying, watch that, don't do that. The next is Scripture that I already mentioned. Here's a layperson interpreting Scripture, literally in the aftermath of the Reformation. Galileo's style is another thing. Galileo would probably be the kind of guy you wouldn't want to sit next to on an airplane. Let me tell you one other thing. He just had this feisty attitude. And he was told if he wrote about the system of heliocentrism, that he should do it in a way that was sort of as if. Okay, you can write about it, but don't write about it as a done deal. That's actually how Copernicus stayed out of trouble, because he said, well, let's just talk about the mathematics. But Galileo wrote like a little dialogue, and he has somebody representing heliocentric system, his own view. He has somebody sort of an interlocutor. And then he has a person representing the Pope's point of view, and he calls that guy Simplicio, which is kind of like calling him dingbat, okay? And the Pope noticed, okay? It's like there was not a sort of a good faith attempt to show this. Galileo was making a case. Should he have been? Yes, we know that now. Also, we have to notice that the politics of the 30 Years' War, he is in 1633 when he has this trial, he is smack in the middle of the 30 Years' War. And there's all kinds of stuff going on. Maybe, and some authors say this, maybe Galileo was sent a signal to Medicis, to say, you guys are messing with the wrong side. Oh, look, see, now we're being closed off. Maybe if I do this, it'll help. No? Okay. Let me read this to you. I want to make a point about how the Catholic Church today sees the Galileo case. And this is a quote from John Paul II, the guy I had up there a minute ago. The greatness of Galileo is known to everyone, like that of Einstein. This was done on the occasion where Einstein's work was being honored. But unlike the latter, whom we are honoring today before the College of Cardinals, the former had to suffer a great deal, that's to say Galileo. We cannot conceal the fact. At the hands of men and organisms of the Church, the Second Vatican Council recognized and deplored certain unwarranted interventions. And then he says, we cannot but deplore certain attitudes not unknown among Christians. Not unknown among Christians is like Pope speak. Us too. Okay, you kind of admit it. Deriving from a short-sighted view, a short-sighted view of the rightful autonomy of science. They have occasioned conflict and controversy and have misled many into thinking that faith and science are opposed. So a couple of things going on in this quote is he refers to the Second Vatican Council, which is the Church's way of trying to grapple with the modern world in the middle of the 20th century in better ways. But then he also continues this, I put him up as a professor, because that's the gig he had before he did the Pope thing. So he's a philosopher, and he's used to interdisciplinary work. And he says, to go beyond this stand taken by the Council, I hope that theologians, scholars, historians, animated by a spirit of sincere collaboration, will study the Galileo case more deeply, and in loyal recognition of what wrongs, from whatever side they come, will dispel the mistrust that still opposes in many minds a fruitful concord between science and faith, between the Church and the world. And he gives us full support to that. And it's interesting to look at the date. This is 1979. He's elected Pope in 78. So within the first year, he says, let's do this. Let's look at this. And if you understand the Catholic Church and the magisterium and its history, we usually just ignore our mistakes. We say, nobody says that anymore. But this guy says, let's bring it up. People are still worried about it. And he says, and he appoints this commission, and the commission comes back, and he says, let's get the record clear. So why did you have to take the core requirement when you went to college? So you could meet this guy, Aristotle. And I want to look just really quickly at how we can use Aristotle to maybe tease out some of the ways that these two voices can come together. Aristotle refers to the material causes, the stuff that something is made of, the formal cause, the thing that shapes it, that makes it what it is. The efficient cause is actually the person or persons that create something. The teleological cause is the goal or purpose of the thing. Quick example. What if you have a chair? The material cause is the wood it's made of. The formal cause is the chair. It's shaped like a chair and not like a table. The efficient cause, it's made by a chair builder. Why? So that a person can sit on it. The quick punchline is, that the universe can be looked at with the same look at causes. What is it doing here? Is there a somebody that put it here? I think each of the causes asks a particular question. The material asks the question what, the formal asks the question how, the efficient the question who, and the teleological the question why. Science answers the what and how questions. When Galileo did his work, he and everybody around him thought they knew the why and the who questions already. So they weren't working on those. Science doesn't do that. Scientists today don't do that. If you're a crick, you can just ignore the other questions if you want to. So what can both faith and science contribute? I think both of these guys, whose pictures were just up, have the same instincts expressed by the ancient literature that we get from the Hebrew Scriptures, that God is behind all this, and we can look at God and what he's done with wonder. The philosophical point that I would say is behind the differences that are sometimes perceived is the difference between reductionism and holism. I'm not going to read these, obviously, but the reductionist says, only look at this level, only look at this part. The holistic approach says, look at all of it. So, I would ask you, who would you put in the picture? I would probably put Einstein and the Pope in there, but I don't know. Maybe Bill Gates goes in there. Maybe speakers this morning I would put in there. It's amazing stuff. Maybe Bob Dylan goes in there. He's a Nobel laureate too. I don't know if the Kardashians make it, but you can take your own choices and say who should be in the conversation. So is that it? No. There's a lot more people to ask. When I say it depends who you ask, like I said before, it's a cottage industry. One of my favorite books is actually by the Dalai Lama, where he says a very non-reductionistic approach. And he's not a theist, but he's a religious thinker that says, can we see beyond just the science itself? I would also say the style that we as people from a faith tradition, that I as a person from a faith tradition bring to this matters a great deal. And so I like this ancient insight, which is not new. It goes back to the first century. Be ready to make a defense to anyone who demands of you an accounting for the hope that is in you, but do it with gentleness and reverence, instead of all the yelling and screaming that we see. So here's credits. If some professor sent you here, they could maybe be extra credits. But if you ask me, my answer would be yes, they're compatible. And I think in looking at them together, we can understand better who we are, we can understand better what the universe is, and I think we can understand better who God is. Thank you.